Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Ask the Experts Live. My name is Chris Rich. I am the CEO and Executive Director for the National Celiac Association. Thank you for joining us this evening for our conversation around the management of celiac disease today and in the future. I want to offer up some quick information and instructions before we get started. The mission of the National Celiac Association is to educate, advocate, and empower individuals, families, and communities affected by celiac disease and non-celiac related conditions. This includes the educational and scientific based information such as what you'll see this evening. But we also have an extensive network of national support assisting those of all demographics and backgrounds. You can find more information about NCA at our website, which is at nationalceliac.org. I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping things before we get started here and introduce our esteemed guest. Our Ask the Experts Live is an educational webinar series that provides an intimate and casual conversation with some of the top professionals in their field of expertise. This series is a complementary piece to the Ask the Experts Q&A section of our website and at nationalceliac.com/Q&A. There we go. And if a question you have does not get addressed during tonight's session, you can always go to that page. That page has topics covering hundreds of questions, and so you'll probably be able to find what you're looking for there related to celiac disease and non-celiac related conditions. Some additional information here for tonight's event. You are welcome to ask general questions through the Q&A feature. That's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click on there. Please also know that this is an educational webinar. No information is intended for diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition. Please seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health providers with any questions that you might have regarding your personal health. The webinar is being recorded. It will be available for viewing on our website at nationalceliac.org. You'll also be able to find it on our YouTube channel. To find that, just go to YouTube and search National Celiac Association. You will also be getting an email as a follow-up to this webinar that will have a link to that recording. So you can look for that in your inbox here in about a week or so. There's a CC button also at the bottom of your screen if you need closed captioning, and then we can go from there. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our esteemed guest speaker for tonight's event, Dr. Benjamin Lebwohl. Dr. Lebwohl received his MD from Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons in 2003, and he completed his internship, his residency, and chief residency in internal medicine at Columbia. He stayed at Columbia as a fellow in digestive and liver disease and joined the faculty of the Celiac Disease Center at Columbia University in 2010. Dr. Lebwohl is a professor of medicine and epidemiology at Columbia University Irvine Medical Center, and he serves as the associate clinical chief of the Division of Gastroenterology and as the director of clinical research at the Celiac Disease Center at Columbia. He is the past president for the Society of the Study of Celiac Disease, and he collaborates with investigators in the United States and abroad in epidemiology, patterns of care, natural history, and therapeutics. He has co-authored more than 350 peer-reviewed publications. His research is supported by the National Institutes of Health, and the past research funding includes the American Gastroenterological Association and the American Scandinavian Foundation. Dr. Lebwohl is also the chair of Gastrointestinal Drugs Advisory Committee of the United States Food and Drug Administration, and he serves as the Institutional Review Board Chair at Columbia University Irvine Medical Center. That is quite a distinguished resume. We are more than honored to have him with us this evening. So I will pass my screen over to him and say thank you and pass it over to Dr. Lebwohl.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you to the NCA for giving me the opportunity to meet with your community and for all the work that you do over the years. I'm really delighted to be here. The title of today's presentation is Management of Celiac Disease Today and in the Future. I'm going to be speaking for 35 minutes, and then we'll have some opportunity for a moderated question and answer. The broad outline of what I'm going to talk about is start with today, the current management of celiac disease, how we do it today, and then try to glimpse into the future by learning about some medications and other technologies that are out there now proposed to assist in the diagnosis or really management of celiac disease. So this is a relatively focused talk. There are a lot of things that are really important for celiac disease patients, newly diagnosed or long veterans of this condition that are not going to be covered, like the changing face of celiac disease, signs and symptoms symptoms of celiac disease, how to make the diagnosis, because that's really an evolving matter, and then really getting into the nitty-gritty on a gluten-free diet. I'm very fortunate to work with two expert dietitians at the Celiac Disease Center at Columbia University. Dietitian evaluation and management is really the cornerstone of the management of celiac disease. And I am not the expert dietitian, and I really need to know my lane. I'm not going to be talking about those details, but we'll certainly be touching upon what the gluten-free diet can do today and what its limitations are. A major caveat will be that I will be discussing in this future section technologies and products in varying stages of development and availability, and I am not endorsing the use of these products. Some of these products are actually available direct to consumer today, so I think it's important for me to point that out at the outset. So let's start with current management of celiac disease. About 20 years ago, the National Institutes of Health put together a consensus conference on celiac disease. This was really when celiac disease was first getting on the map. It had previously been thought to be a rare condition, particularly in the United States. And finally, some research had come out showing that nearly 1% of individuals have this condition. And so there needed to be some understanding of diagnosis, but also management. And out of this consensus statement came this handy acronym. I would say that this is still a useful way to think about management of celiac disease. C stands for consultation with a skilled dietitian, and it's important that that go first. There's nothing more important. And when I see a patient as an adult gastroenterologist and I go over the diagnosis and management, I tell them I'm going to recommend a bunch of things, but if you only listen to me about one thing, it's see our dietitian. There's nothing more important. Education about the disease is crucial. That's from the dietitian, but also from other experts, including the physician. Lifelong adherence to a gluten-free diet, identification and treatment of nutritional deficiencies, access to an advocacy group, and continuous long-term follow-up by a multidisciplinary team. So, there are a lot of broad statements here, and really the devil's in the details. So what do we actually do? This has been changing, and here is the most recent iteration of one set of guidelines that offers a algorithm on how to manage someone with celiac disease. This is a guide really intended for gastroenterologists. These are guidelines that we published in the American Journal of Gastroenterology, updated most recently in 2023. And I should point out these are not the only guidelines out there, and you will find that some guidelines suggest checking certain things every 6 months instead of every 3 months, etc. And so there's no exact science to this. These are not, I would say, evidence-based guidelines that have been subjected to strict, rigorous, randomized trials. This is what experts tend to do because it seems to make sense. So after the diagnosis of celiac disease is made, these guidelines suggest a follow-up 3 to 6 months later, where we review symptoms, serology or antibody levels, make sure people are up to date with any appropriate immunizations, talk about considering testing first-degree relatives, and then at that point, assessing whether the person is getting better or not. And if they get better, see them in a year or two. And if they're not getting better, have them circle back with the dietitian as a follow-up. And so this is, I would say, the most common way things are done. You can see there are some other health maintenance matters discussed. For example, a DEXA scan, that's a bone density that we offer among adults at around the 1 year point. And then there's the issue of repeating an intestinal biopsy to see if the intestine's healed. Shown on the left is a biopsy of a patient with newly diagnosed celiac disease. Healthy villi, which are these projections of the small intestine, they're these finger-like projections. They're not present on the left. They're these small nubs. And we need these villi to provide the surface area to absorb nutrients and to have healthy digestion and absorption. And shown on the left is what happens to an intestine that's been damaged by an immune system that's reacting to dietary gluten. Shown on the right are healthy villi. They look like long fingers. And actually, shown on the right is someone with celiac disease after starting the gluten-free diet. In many people, the villi in such a person is indistinguishable from someone without celiac disease at all. With adoption of the gluten-free diet, mucosal healing occurs. The villi typically grow back. And one important question we've been trying real hard to answer is, does it matter? Do we need to check for it? And is it an important endpoint? A number of studies in the past 10 to 15 years have shown that indeed um, it seems to matter that your intestines heal because not everyone heals. People, particularly those who get exposed to gluten fairly regularly with a fair amounts of gluten, they are less likely to heal. There have been a number of studies looking at what are the implications of failing to heal. They were recently summarized in a review article just published this past January, and the circles in red show the bad things that could happen that are at increased risk of happening among people who, in the long term, don't heal their intestines. Not all of these have been replicated. In other words, I would not say every single one of these is rock solid, but I believe, based on a number of studies, that failing to heal is bad for bone health, and it's also bad for certain cancer risk, particularly lymphoma and related lymphoproliferative cancers. Um, and so we offer a repeat biopsy 2 years after the initial diagnosis in order to assess whether the patient is doing what they need to be doing with regard to the degree of precautions that they're taking. Not everyone agrees with that approach, and guidelines are a little bit vague. They talk about shared decision making because there's a bit of a debate and, when thinking about should I get a repeat or follow-up biopsy 2 or 3 years after my first biopsy, my first diagnosis, well, there are reasons to do it. The biopsy tends to be more sensitive than blood-based markers in terms of detecting ongoing gluten exposure. It does correlate with certain important outcomes. And if it's normal, which it usually is, it validates the patient's current precautions. There's always someone out there who's stricter than you. Every person with celiac disease living with the need for the gluten-free diet recognizes there's someone out there taking even more precautions than I'm taking. The question is, do you need to do that? Because that can be at a cost of quality of life. And so if it's normal, that's a good way to say your current precautions, whatever they are good enough for you. The main reason not to is if you're already doing the best you can and you feel well and the blood markers are good, um, do you really need to know this additional information? Would it lead to a change if you're not willing to up your game even further? And so some of my colleagues in other celiac disease centers, they don't push the follow-up biopsy after a couple of years. If the patient is feeling well and doing well, we offer it and we engage in shared decision making. So the gluten-free diet is the treatment. It is safe. It is effective. And we've known this for many years. We've known this really since the 1930s, when Willem Dicke first proposed gluten as the culprit in celiac disease. In the United States, when research really started to take off about 20 years ago in celiac disease, we had studies like this coming out of Mayo Clinic. Um, in terms of people who had diarrhea at the outset of their celiac disease, once they start the gluten-free diet, the majority get better. And the great majority no longer are having diarrhea every day. It works, and it works fairly quickly. This study looked at the time course to improvement among those who do improve, and you can see that even within a week, you get some people feeling better, and within a month, you actually get most people feeling substantially better. Not every symptom gets better this quickly, as many people in the community know. Fatigue can take the longest to get better. But the gastrointestinal symptoms usually do get better, and they get better fairly quickly. That's not to say that everyone gets better. And in fact, 20 to 25% of people with celiac disease at any given moment are having recurrent or persistent symptoms. And that's one of the roles of a celiac disease center to help understand and tease that out and treat it. So the gluten-free diet works, and yet it's got problems. I borrowed this slide from my friend Dan Leffler, who's at Takeda and is also involved in the Harvard group, their celiac center. And you can see there are a number of difficulties with the diet. I would say that the poor palatability issue has certainly gotten a lot better, but the cost has not gotten a lot better. If anything, that's gotten worse. It is an expensive diet. There is conflicting information, and that's why organizations like NCA are so important. So you can go to a trusted source, a vetted source where they can give you consistent information that's practical and accurate. There are risks when eating out. There are social pressures. This is particularly prevalent among our teens and the college-bound individuals. There are issues about inadequate or inaccurate labeling. Supplements, which are very popular among people in our community, are very poorly regulated and sometimes even contain traces of gluten. And so those are the difficulties. And there are hazards too. If a gluten-free diet is done without the advice and input and guidance of an expert dietitian, often fiber intake plummets. And that can be bad for the bowels. It can also be bad for weight. It can be bad for cardiovascular risk. There's theoretical concern about heavy metals in people who have a diet very high in certain gluten-free substitute, like rice-based products. I would say this has been measurable, but largely theoretical. In other words, it's not clear that that's actually caused clinical symptoms. And then finally, disordered eating, especially someone with those tendencies or a history who then adopts a gluten-free diet. This can trigger that. And then even a more low-grade phenomenon that's not disordered eating, but a maladaptive pattern in which people might say that when they leave their home, they're just not eating anything all day until they get home late at night and then have a very large meal. There are many different ways one's eating practices can be maladaptive when faced with the challenges of a gluten-free diet. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And so for that reason, there are these technologies out there to help manage. And I would start by giving an overview of drugs. There is no drug that's approved today to treat celiac disease, but there are a whole bunch in the pipeline. And shown here are those drugs that I would say, have the largest number of clinical trials with them and the longest track record. There was a recent review article that I borrowed this table from Dr. DeSchepolo and colleagues that categorizes these drugs into three main buckets. One is detoxifying gluten prior to its presentation. By presentation, I mean prior to it's being shown to our immune system. And so these are really enzyme-related therapies, in addition to genetically modified gluten. The second bucket is immune modulation, changing the immune system, damping it or tamping it down a little bit. This is very much taking a page from our colleagues who treat or are patients who have inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's and colitis. There's been an explosion of new drugs that modify the immune system and interfere with the inflammatory cascade in those conditions. And it's likely that that will have a role in celiac disease as well. And then finally, and this might be considered the holy grail, tolerance promotion, changing the immune system to switch off its notion of gluten being a threat. Basically, retraining the immune system to no longer see gluten as dangerous and so as to no longer react to gluten. Shown here is a diagram, a scientific mechanism of how we believe gluten causes the symptoms and findings that happen in celiac disease. Basically, this diagram goes from top to bottom. You have dietary gluten, which are these little green ovals, and then they get into the gut because they're not totally digested. And when they're in the gut wall, you have these cells, these antigen presenting cells, T cells, B cells, components of our immune system that see it as a threat, react to it, and create inflammation. And the gut becomes the collateral damage. And so we have a fairly good understanding of the direction in which this happens. And for that reason, we have the ability to consider areas where we could block the process. And that includes digesting the gluten to begin with, so-called glutenases, or modulating the gut wall to prevent it from getting in, and then blocking the various communicators that these components of the immune system use to communicate with each other, with themselves. And so these are the main buckets and I want to go over a couple of example clinical trials and their results because we've learned some important lessons from them. An early drug that was developed was lataglutenase. This is an enzyme. Think about like lactase or lactate, this enzyme that you take if you're lactose intolerant, that you take while you eat dairy so as to digest the dairy and prevent it from causing symptoms. So there are enzymes that have been developed that have very strong affinity for gluten, that break down gluten so as to make it no longer visible to the immune system. And so Lataglutenase is one such enzyme. And so its first study involved a gluten challenge. That means people, volunteers with celiac disease, were actually given gluten. They were given basically the equivalent of a slice or two of bread a day for 6 weeks, and they were giving it together with either lataglutenase or a placebo, a sugar pill, something that's inert. And what they were studying were symptoms, but also how tall the villi were. These villi are a sign of celiac health. They get short when gluten is present persistently. And so among those who got placebo plus gluten, their villi got shorter. The y-axis is how tall their villi were on average. And among people who got gluten plus the drug, lataglutenase, their villi did not get significantly shorter. This was very promising. This was one of the first positive clinical trials in celiac disease. It shows that we can potentially attenuate what gluten is doing to people's intestines. This led to a bigger trial, the Celiaction study. This was the first study that I got to be involved with as a site principal investigator for a celiac disease drug. And here, it was no longer about giving people gluten and giving drug. It was now for people with celiac disease who are trying their best to be on a gluten-free diet, and yet were still having symptoms and were still having damaged guts. They had short villi. These were people who were persistently getting glutened frequently. And so they were then given this drug with every meal or a placebo. They were told, keep doing what you're doing, try your best to avoid gluten, and let's see if your symptoms get better and if your villi get taller. And this was a negative trial. It did not meet its primary endpoint. Um, People who got the drug got better. They had improved histology. They had improved villus height to crypt depth ratio, but so did the people who got placebo. What happened? Everyone got stricter with regard to avoiding gluten. People were told, keep doing what you're doing. But the so-called trial effect, also known as the Hawthorne phenomenon, is a very common observed effect where once someone enrolls in a clinical trial, they know they're being watched and they're filling out surveys very frequently, they intentionally or unintentionally change their behavior. And so for people who are getting glutened inadvertently all the time, once they joined a trial, they stopped getting glutens. They got stricter. And so it became impossible to see if this drug was actually effective because there was no gluten in either group. So um, uh, this was a real challenge for people with non-responsive celiac disease. But subsequent trials have tried to deal with this. This is one such trial of another enzyme therapy called TAC062. This is the Illuminate study. It's a similar type of study where they tell people keep doing what you're doing. We're not going to intentionally have you, eat slices of bread and see what happens. But in order to mitigate the so-called trial effect, participants in this trial actually were given small amounts of gluten, small amounts occasionally. Basically, they were given these little bars. They look like granola bars. Sometimes they had gluten in it. Sometimes they didn't. Patients didn't know, or subjects didn't know when they weren't. And this was called simulated inadvertent gluten exposure, so as to make sure that if this drug works, it can be given the opportunity to work because everyone was getting a little bit of occasional gluten, akin to the kind of cross contact or accidental gluten exposure people get all the time in the real world. So another trial, and this one was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of our most prestigious journals, was published because it's the first trial to show improvement of biopsy results and improvement of symptoms. This is a drug that blocks an enzyme called transglutaminase 2, and that's critical in the processing of gluten to make it more threatening to the immune system. So this is a phase 2 randomized trial, more on phases in a moment. People were given, again, 3 grams of gluten for 6 weeks, and they were given it together with drug or with placebo. And their results were impressive in that this drug attenuated or reduced the kind of damage that we saw in their intestine. And so the 3 panels on the left are all different doses of this drug. The panel all the way on the right is placebo. And you can see in the placebo group, there was a consistent drop in how tall people's villi were. And in the people who got drug, there was a less consistent drop or a more stability in this drug, in this group. And so this drug is moving on to further phase trials. People also felt better when they got that drug as compared to placebo. One last trial. This is that so-called tolerance-inducing therapy. This is in trials right now. A phase 2A study was completed and published a few years back. This involved a 2-week gluten challenge with a lot of gluten, 12 grams a day. So that's 4 or 5 slices of bread for 3 days, and then 6 grams a day for another 11 days. People got an infusion of this drug, or they got a saline infusion. They didn't know which they were getting. And then what they were looking at were a specific kind of white blood cell circulating in the blood that responds to gluten. They also looked at histology or biopsy results, and similarly to those gluten challenge studies, those who got placebo, their villi got shorter, and those who got the drug, their villi were on the whole stable. So this drug went on to another trial that is just about wrapping up in terms of enrollment, and so we eagerly await further results. So I say phase 2, what does that mean? Well, there are 4 phases. And phase 1 studies are really just looking at safety. What dose can we give to people before they start to get side effects? Often these phase 1 studies are in people even without the condition, even healthy volunteers. Phase 2, which many of these current celiac drug trials are in, have multiple different doses because the makers of the drug, they're trying to figure out what's the right dose in terms of the best sort of balance between side effects and effectiveness. They use a placebo group, and if it's successful, they move on to phase 3. Phase 3, that's where the sponsor, the owner of the drug, says, this is where we are putting our dime down. We think it's going to be this dose, this outcome, and it's going to be placebo controlled. And if you have 2 phase 3 studies that are positive, it goes to FDA, the United States Food and Drug Administration, for consideration of approval. We have not yet had that happen in celiac disease, but that day is coming. And then after approval, so-called phase 4 is where we look for long-term side effects and safety and effectiveness over even years. And the FDA could revoke approval if new problems emerge. Shown here is a chart I made as best I could showing every phase 2 and phase 3 study in celiac disease. The rightmost column shows the result. You can see there's a lot of red, but also a fair amount of green. Most drugs don't make it out of testing. They get abandoned eventually because of issues of safety or effectiveness. But there are so many drugs in development right now in celiac disease that I am very optimistic that at least one of these drugs, or one of the drugs being developed now, are going to make it through to phase 3 and beyond. You can see there's been only one phase 3 study so far. It's for a drug called liraglutide acetate. It did not meet its endpoint. It was stopped early for futility because it was not superior to placebo when they took a peek at an interim analysis. And so, what would come next with phase 3? It's not clear. There are a whole bunch in phase 2, and if any are successful and feasible, then they move on to phase 3. Those are drugs. What about other technologies? Well, gluten detection has been a topic of debate and discussion in the celiac disease community for a number of years now. Gluten can be detected in food before you eat it, shown on the left, or it can be detected in body secretions after you might have been exposed and you want to figure out if you recently got gluten. That's shown on the right. This portable sensor was introduced around 2016, and basically, this is a device that will tell you if there's gluten in the food that you're testing. And it's designed to bring to restaurants, and then you test a sample. And it tells you that gluten was found, or it gives you a smiley face, in other words, gluten-free. It's far from perfect. It does not detect gluten in fermented foods. So, like soy sauce, for example. And other forms of gluten, for example, like in a French fry batter, hydrolyzed gluten, very hard to detect. And then also in certain contexts, it might be too sensitive. It might detect less than 20 parts per million of gluten, which for most people is really an irrelevantly small amount. So, its utility is really unknown. And, there was some interest in studying it, but unfortunately, you just can't get it anymore. The company that owns it has really had supply issues, and so you can't really order it or its single-use cartridges. I would also say that any sampling, food sensor has the issue that sampling is just a sample, and you're facing a whole plate of food, and if you don't sample the part of your plate that has gluten in it, then you might have falsely reassuring information. Now, that product is no longer available, but there are many other people interested in this technology, and there are more gluten detectors in development. Just today, I got a promotional email from a company that's about to launch, and um, the technology that they are touting is that you basically take like the equivalent of a Q-tip shown on the left and sort of swab various parts of your plate to see if it's gluten-free. And then you mix it in a solution, just like you're swabbing your nose for a COVID test. You're swabbing your meal for gluten, and then you put the dropper. It looks very familiar. We've all done these kinds of home tests. And then you wait 3 minutes. Now, this is going to be subject to the same concerns about sampling that first sensor was subject to. And also, we have not yet seen validation data. So I have no idea how accurate this is at this point, but we await further data. And more importantly, we await studies on knowing whether this makes people better off, whether it improves symptoms, quality of life. What is available right now are these gluten technologies that can measure gluten in the urine and in the stool. Now, a stool test allows the tester to pick up gluten that was eaten in the last 4 days, very small amounts. The problem is no one wants to do any tests on their own stool, right? It's much more practical if you're going to be testing to test urine. And so it's not quite as sensitive, and it only looks at about a day or two of your last exposures, and it's not super sensitive. But the studies that looked at this found that tons of people with celiac disease trying their best to be on a gluten-free diet are getting glutened. And the relevance of that will really vary. If you have someone with ongoing symptoms, it might be very helpful to know this. If you have someone who feels fine, it might be unwelcome news. We don't know how important it is to monitor urine for gluten. So we are not at the point where we can say we recommend this. Its process, for example, for urine, shown here are the instructions. You gotta urinate in a cup, and then you have to use a little syringe, and then you put the syringe into the stopper, and then you mix that, and then just like again with the COVID test, you use that to put a couple of droplets, and then you see. And if there's a 2 lines, it means you were glutened, and if there's no line, there's no gluten detected. What I'd say is for these urine tests, they're not super sensitive, but as far as we can tell, based on the published studies, if it's negative, it's possible it missed something. You might have been glutened a day or two before, but maybe a small amount that didn't show up in the urine. But if it's positive, it shows gluten, it's very likely real. The only question is how important is it? My own practice, I suggest considering it in someone who feels fine, but then they intermittently get super sick, and we don't know if those episodes are related to gluten. So if you get these episodes, testing could conceivably be helpful, but we honestly don't know. We have what we call in medicine clinical equipoise. We have genuine uncertainty whether such a technology, such a treatment will be beneficial. When you have clinical equipoise, really that is a situation where you'd benefit from a randomized trial. And so we actually have a randomized trial currently open that involves detecting gluten in the urine, this technology. It is exclusively for recently diagnosed patients, people who had a biopsy diagnosis of celiac disease and who started the gluten-free diet in the last 4 months. So the great majority of people with celiac disease would not qualify, but a freshly, recently diagnosed patient would. They need to be a patient plugged into one of these centers. We started recruiting at the Celiac Disease Center at Columbia in the fall. We are in the group at Beth Israel Deaconess recently launched. They are open, and then Chicago and Vanderbilt are in the process of starting up, likely in the next month or two. Being involved in this in a trial involves being willing to be randomly assigned to the standard of care, where you see the dietitian regularly over the course of a year, or all of that plus we provide you these gluten urine tests, and we encourage you to use them every week, at least once a week. And then after 1 year, during that year, we measure a bunch of symptoms. We do a bunch of questionnaires. And then at the end of the year, we take a follow-up biopsy, and we're going to compare the two groups with regard to the extent of healing. We're also going to compare with regard to symptoms and regard to quality of life, things that really matter to our patients. This is a trial that's currently open for enrollment at Columbia and at Beth Israel Deaconess. And you need to be between 18 and 75. It's not a small lift. You need to really be involved. You have to fill out surveys a number of times over the course of the year. If you're assigned to the technology log, you need you need to fill out a weekly log reporting what you're doing. You need to do a blood test in the beginning and end of the trial, urine specimen, and you need to have a study biopsy that the study actually pays for at the end of 1 year. People are compensated. If you know someone or you yourself might qualify, please reach out. QR code is shown here. But again, this is only for people who are recently diagnosed on a diet for less than 4 months and you're a current existing patient at one of these celiac disease centers. We're only taking center patients at least at this point. Speaking of our center, we host a biennial conference, and it is a free webinar. The speakers come to New York City and speak. And if you found this interesting, particularly if you are interested in learning more about these non-dietary therapies, these medications, we are going to have representatives from those sponsors, those medications, coming to New York and sharing their latest data. And we'll have roundtable discussions to discuss what are the most important endpoints. And so that's May 1st and 2nd, 2025. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I will stop sharing, and I will ask Chris to moderate the question and answer period.
Absolutely. Thank you for the fantastic presentation, Dr. Lebwohl. I did have a question myself after watching it. You talked about one of those first trials that you were a part of where the improved histology was seen both with the drug and also the placebo. Was that something that was somewhat expected given the history that you know of people being diligent during their participation in trials, or was there somewhat surprise there?
I'll tell you. So there was always concern about it. If it were expected, it wouldn't have happened. I mean, that's a multi-million-dollar lesson learned, right? I mean, this sponsor, they've got this drug. They want to prove that it works in people who are hurting, and they couldn't prove it because everyone was being too strict. It's great they were being strict. It's great they were feeling better, but it was an unfortunate turn for this drug that then failed to show that it was doing anything. If you
Yeah.
want to show your drug works, you need people who are having gluten on purpose or by accident. So it was a very expensive lesson, and future trials sort of learned from that lesson. So it wasn't that expected, Chris.
Okay. Okay. So that was what my curious. We've had so many good questions come in. And so I want to try to get to as many of these as possibly mindful of your time, of everyone else's time. So we're going to go ahead and fire through some of these. Some questions that came in before during registration, as also questions that we've received live during your talk. First question I did want to ask is what further research is being done on IL-2 as a diagnostic biomarker? And then the question being, are we ensuring that all genders and ethnicities are participating in that type of a study?
Okay, so really good questions. The first one is about IL-2. It's the formal name is interleukin 2. This is a cytokine, which is a small molecule that is a signaler or communication device that white blood cells use with each other to alert other white blood cells. Hey, come here, there's inflammation going on, there's a problem. It turns out that IL-2 is one of the big players in celiac disease. People with celiac disease who, when they eat gluten, get really sick, they typically have a big spike in blood IL-2 that's measurable. And so it's become useful as a potential diagnostic to figure out if someone has celiac disease. Now, we've got good blood tests for celiac disease. They're not perfect, but they're good. But that's only in people who are eating gluten. What about someone who's been gluten-free for years, but they don't know if they have celiac disease for sure? That's really hard. And some of them are unwilling or unable to start eating gluten again. So there is a group out of Australia that is developing an assay, a test that basically takes that person's blood, puts it in a tube, incubates it with gluten, and sees what happens to IL-2. So it's an in vitro gluten challenge. You don't have to give the person gluten, you give their blood gluten in a test tube. These results were presented at a national meeting last spring, not yet published in full peer review. So still, exciting, but all the data isn't yet out there. But it's potentially a very promising advance if it turns out to be true. So that's the IL-2 story. The other question, another important one, is about representation. So there are many faces to celiac disease. In the old days, we used to think that celiac disease was a predominantly European condition, people of Irish descent, when in fact, there are many people outside of that sort of belt, outside of Northern Europe, with celiac disease. There are Black people with celiac disease and Hispanic people with celiac disease in the United States. They have less of it than white people, but they also are more likely to have it missed. They don't get it tested for. So there are disparities. On top of that, randomized trials and clinical trials in general have historically been neglecting to enroll enough people who are in underrepresented minoritized groups and underrepresented just in biomedical research in general. There are many reasons for this, and there are historic reasons for distrust on patients' parts to contribute to or participate in research. As a result, whenever you look at a randomized trial, it's all too common to see 96% white, right? Not reflecting the general population. This is a systemic problem. It is just as bad in the world of celiac disease as it is in other conditions. There are efforts to mitigate. There are certain trials now that are finally providing Spanish language materials. I would also say that there's interest um, in expanding beyond adults, right? Because what about children? Children will need drugs potentially, or they stand to benefit. And so there's a little bit of movement in expanding from 18 and up to people who are like adolescent age. So inclusion is really important, but it's really difficult too.
Okay. Thank you for addressing those. I think on the other end, you just talked about children. We've had a couple questions come in about general age-related medical screenings. As somebody goes through having celiac disease, and as they've gone through this, is there a recommendation for modern adults in the years following the diagnosis addressing, the different ages that there are when they were diagnosed, or is it pretty much recommended that it's the same type of screening?
So the current guidelines that are out there that describe what you should check when are, I would say, age agnostic on the whole. And so, regardless of when you were diagnosed, whether you were diagnosed as a little kid or whether you're just diagnosed as a middle-aged adult, there are certain procedures or parts of monitoring that are less likely to be done in children. The follow-up biopsy historically has been much less commonly pursued in children, in part because an endoscopy with a biopsy is often a bigger deal, especially in younger children, where it might require general anesthesia. It can be an ordeal. And so historically, that hasn't been done, though it's starting to come back a little bit because we've learned that healing can be incomplete in children, especially those with persistent symptoms. The other one that we often don't do in kids, but do in adults is a bone density, simply because what's considered a normal bone density varies a lot by age and really starts to crystallize by your mid-20s. That's when you achieve peak bone mass on average. And so if you want to know if someone has healthy bones, we generally wait until they're a little bit older, around the mid-20s, and do at least a one-time bone density after diagnosis to make sure that the person does not have early onset osteoporosis. Apart from that, it's pretty much agnostic to what age someone was diagnosed at.
Okay, okay. One of the questions we received in during your conversation was somebody asked about immune modulation, and does an immune modulation, especially during long term or done long term, I should say, does that lead to organ damage or dysfunction? Do you have any thoughts towards that?
It's a real safety concern anytime a drug is modifying the immune system. What are going to be the implications? The main concern that that we have is less about organ damage and more about infections. And you know, we have an immune system for a reason. And if you try to dampen it in order to reduce the reaction to gluten, might you also be reducing the reaction to infections that you want to react against? So that's a concern. The immune system also, in addition to fighting infections, also has a role in preventing cancer, actually. And so some people with very suppressed immune system, for example, people with advanced AIDS, or people who are on very powerful immunosuppressant medicine after an organ transplant, they have increased risks of certain cancers. So any medicine that decreases the immune response, there's going to be a potential concern for those outcomes. So safety really has to be paramount. And fortunately, we got precedent. The worlds of Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, that's inflammatory bowel disease, psoriasis, they've all had an explosion of medicines that modulate the immune system. And so the way to monitor for infections and long-term complications has been worked out. We don't have to invent the wheel. And so the kind of things you look for, both directly, infections, measuring them, and indirectly, measuring certain sort of immune functions in your blood. These are out there that we can borrow from other trials, but it's a real potential concern.
Okay. One of the questions that, and this one I believe came in while you were speaking about and showing your slides on the damaged villi, was somebody asked, is it true that those who are asymptomatic, is that due to undamaged part of their intestines still having the ability to absorb nutrients? And if so, why are there other patients who get major symptoms with very minimal gluten exposure with a healed intestine?
Yeah. So one of the big abiding mysteries that I wish we could solve, that we really need more research in, is the disconnect between the damage we see, both at diagnosis and follow-up, and how someone's feeling. You can have two people with celiac disease living with celiac disease for years, and one of them, um, when they eat gluten, they get super sick. And the other, they eat gluten, they don't feel a thing. We don't understand that. They could have identical looking intestines. There's really no well understood relationship. There are some markers. So some people, they have this burst of interleukin 2, as I mentioned, and that can cause symptoms. But why the gut and its appearance is so disconnected from how someone is feeling is an abiding mystery. I wish I knew. And we can, say, well, maybe it's other parts of the intestine that are compensating. All of that is what we call hand waving. We really don't know. We have to be very humble about this. And what that means is that if you got someone with celiac disease, they're not feeling well, you gotta figure it out. It's not always persistent damage. It's not always gluten. Conversely, if you have someone with celiac disease and they're feeling great, you can't assume that there's everything is fine inside. So for that reason, we check antibody levels. We consider a biopsy simply because there's this disconnect between symptoms and what's actually happening biologically internally.
And you mentioned, and this goes back to another question that we had that came in during registration was, you have somebody who they've been following the gluten-free diets, they were diagnosed, but then, they're still having stomach issues. For continued treatment, do you recommend that they still be talking to their primary care physician? Should they go see a specialist about that? What do you recommend there?
We are in a very heterogeneous, diverse medical ecosystem. Some people live in a big city, they have access to celiac specialists. Some people are in a rural place where they can't see a gastroenterologist, let alone a celiac gastroenterologist. So it really varies depending on what kind of access you have. In the era of telemedicine, especially early during the pandemic, when state telemedicine, regulations were allowed you to see anyone from around the country, people were coming from all over, Zooming with us, asking for advice. Regardless of who that person is, the general principles are the same. We basically try to figure out, why is someone not feeling better? Is it because of gluten exposure? Is it because of something else? That something else is a list. It's a long list, but it is a finite list. And so you can sort of go over it and test. The first thing we do is, are we sure this person's got celiac disease? Because sometimes we scratch the surface, look at the initial data that supported the diagnosis, and it was not celiac disease. And that's why they're not better. But once we know that they have celiac disease, then we have a list. Number one is gluten. We look for gluten exposure, and there are a few different ways we can do that, as we discussed. And then there's irritable bowel syndrome, which is super common, and you can have celiac disease plus IBS. And then there are some other coexisting conditions. Some people also have inflammatory bowel disease. Some people have another food intolerance. There's one randomized trial that shows one proven intervention for people with celiac disease and ongoing symptoms, and that is a low FODMAP diet. So a low FODMAP diet, FODMAP being an acronym for fermentable oligodimonosaccharides and polyols, is a diet that has a pretty good track record as a treatment for irritable bowel syndrome. But even among people who don't have that formal diagnosis, if you take a celiac patient with ongoing symptoms and you give them a low FODMAP diet, it's been proven to be superior to a gluten-free diet with regard to managing these symptoms, particularly bloating. Bloating, which is a very common symptom, and it can cause a good amount of distress for many of our patients. Low FODMAP diet can work for bloating. The problem with a low FODMAP diet is it's difficult to do in the long term because it's very restrictive, and it really shouldn't be done without the guidance of an expert dietitian, because it can lead to maladaptive eating, it can be unhealthy. It's not a forever diet. It should involve a reintroduction period where you introduce elements of FODMAPs sequentially so as to identify triggers. But it's out there and it works. And so, people with celiac disease and ongoing symptoms sometimes need to educate their doctors if their physicians aren't familiar with what's out there. So there's an evidence base behind it, and you shouldn't be resigned to suffering. So there are ways, and other avenues to explore if you're having ongoing symptoms.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. And a follow-up question that kind of came in. It's not really a follow-up, but it's along the same lines of diagnosis. Are there new ways that you know of in terms of diagnosing refractory celiac disease?
So refractory celiac disease is a rare subtype of celiac disease that a lot of people, and including our celiac especially, we worry about. We worry about it because it can be very dangerous, can even be life-threatening, but it's extremely rare. And with each subsequent study that looks at this condition, it's less and less common. Far less than 1% of people with celiac disease develop true refractory celiac disease. It refers to ongoing symptoms and malabsorption, diarrhea, unintentional weight loss, despite evidence of total gluten avoidance. And There are a couple of types, and one of the types can turn into a kind of lymphoma that can be difficult to treat. Really, the way to detect that kind of refractory celiac disease requires a specialty center, because it requires specific kinds of biopsies that involve hematology-oriented pathologists to look at the kind of T cells that are in the gut. The great majority of people with celiac disease and ongoing symptoms do not have this condition. Non-responsive celiac disease is far, far more common, more than 20 times as common. That refers to ongoing symptoms despite trying to be gluten-free. That is that list of causes. Refractory celiac disease is a tiny but important and worrisome list. For me, unintentional weight loss is a sort of trigger. And then the other thing to know is it's an extremely rare phenomenon in people younger than age 40. So the great majority of people are older. And it would I don't think there's been a case of true refractory type 2 celiac disease in anyone under 30. And even in one's 30s, really uncommon. The handful of cases we've had in the celiac disease center, Columbia, mostly people in their 70s. And often the story is childhood diagnosis, and then they were told that they didn't have celiac disease anymore, and then they ate gluten for many decades. And then finally, when they went gluten-free, it was sort of too late, and it caused this kind of refractory celiac disease. So medically, important for us to know about and to learn how to best treat, but fortunately, extremely rare.
I'd like to thank everybody for sending their questions in. We're going to have time for two more. And so we'll get to those now for the sake of time here. So one question that came in was, is anyone looking at biologics and which are trending in the food allergy world as a promising for celiac disease? Or are any tolerance promoting drugs in the celiac community that show promise for food allergy?
So yeah, so among that list I showed, there are biologics like alimtelimab is a biologic that is an antibody that acts on the OX40 ligand. There are several biologics that target interleukin 15, which is proven to be an important communicator of another cytokine in celiac disease. Biologics have really revolutionized the management of these other autoimmune conditions, and so they hold potential promise in celiac disease. The concern, of course, is biologics do have an effect on the immune system, as I discussed previously, and so we have to make sure that safety is paramount.
Okay. And the last question, and this one really does come in every time that we have a medical professional on and somebody who is involved with research and highly esteemed as such as yourself. The question being, how soon might we have an approved medication or therapy available to treat celiac disease?
Yeah, so I have to really hedge here, right? Because I used to say 5 to 10 years, and that was far more than 5 to 10 years ago. So, um, it's hard to know because, you think about it. Each of these drugs is running a race. Any given drug, if you look at it, it is most likely going to fail. It's just a matter, it's a numbers game. How many drugs are out there, and which of these is going to make it through the gate? And once one makes it through the gate and sort of other groups figure out, okay, that's how you prove that a drug works in terms of picking the trial design and endpoint, then the floodgates will really open. When that will be, I don't know. I will say in the next few months, we're going to be hearing about a bunch more phase 2 results, depending on whether those are positive. Then some might go on to phase 3. Phase 3 takes a couple of years to actually be executed. And I don't know if any one of those phase 3 is going to be successful. So it could be as soon as 5 years, but it could be, it could be more than 20. I'm thinking it's going to be closer to 5 years. We're getting ready for it. We are making preparations in terms of working with FDA because they are going to have to make the decision of whether to approve a drug. And they are already coming to us saying, all right, what are the criteria in terms of endpoints? What sort of guidance should we give to sponsors, drug makers, with regard to how to prove a drug works? And they're giving this advice. So we're getting ready for it. When it'll actually happen, I can't say.
Okay. Well, we appreciate your insight. And again, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to answer questions this evening and also for your work and dedication to our celiac community. And I want to thank everybody also who attended this evening for your questions, for your participation. Please continue to visit our NCA website. Go there for more Q&A. Like we talked about at the beginning, we have a lot of information there and resources that can help you out and address some of the questions that may have come in that we didn't get to this evening. So also look at our website and watch our social media. We will have more of these Ask the Expert live webinar series events. So keep looking there. But Dr. Lebwohl, thank you so much. We very much appreciate you joining us this evening.
Thank you, Chris, thank you, NCA, and thank you to our community for watching and participating.
Yeah. So on behalf of Dr. Lebwohl, myself, the entire team at NCA, thank you so much. Look for the link to this recording to come to your email and also be on our website here in about a week. But have a wonderful remainder of your evening.